senior senator using a four-letter word to mock another congressman.
All of your public comments don't talk about meritocracy. They talk about liberal democratic efforts that are destroying the military, that those people are our enemies. That's not meritocracy. That's a political view. And your goal, as I see emerging, is to politicize the military in favor of your particular position. This week, the Department of Homeland Security sent another request for DoD support to transport ammunition, quote, to authorize military forces to detain or arrest American citizens, to provide DHS with military drone surveillance support, and to have the Marine Corps advise DHS on running joint operations. Is it your intent to improve these requests? How are you paying for this? Is this done on a reimbursable basis by the Department of Homeland Security, or is the Department of Defense paying for this?
Jack Reed just torched Pete Hegseth on live TV, and it was a demolition. One shocking sentence from Reed left Hegseth scrambling, his tough guy rhetoric collapsing faster than a paper tank in the rain. If you thought Reed played nice, think again. This was a political beatdown for the history books.
Which would be the worst blow to the professionalism of the United States military and would undercut readiness, undercut retention, because I can see officers receiving these emails beginning to wonder very seriously if they should continue.
It's not long ago when Jack Reed delivered a line that cut straight through Pete Hegseth's entire argument. Reed said, "That's not meritocracy, that's a political purge in uniform." This wasn't some policy squabble or a dry debate about procedure. Reed was calling out, in front of the entire chamber, the dangerous idea that America's military could be twisted into a partisan tool.
You're a very understanding chairman. I like that. I like that. Ms. Hegseth, you've written in its quote, "Oh yeah, and fire any general who hasn't carried water for Obama and Biden's extra constitution and agenda-driven transformation for our military. Clean house and start over." It's come to my attention that current serving military personnel have received emails threatening them with being fired for supporting the current DoD policies.
And this wasn't just theory. Reed pointed to something far darker, evidence that serving officers had been receiving chilling emails, the kind that send a knot into your stomach.
One mail that was sent to a military officer with the subject line, "Clean house," reminiscent of your specific comment.
One subject line read, "Clean house." The message told an officer that he and his spouse would be placed on a removal list. Their careers, their pensions, even their personal security were threatened, simply because they were accused of supporting current Pentagon policies.
With the incoming administration looking to remove disloyal, corrupt, traitorous, liberal officers such as yourself, we will certainly be putting your name into the list of those personnel to be removed. We know you support the woke DEI policies and will ensure you never again influence anyone in the future. You and the redacted spouse's name will be lucky if you're able to collect your military requirement.
The language dripped with menace. Disloyal, corrupt, traitorous liberal officers. That's not discipline. That's intimidation. Reed didn't hesitate to connect those threats directly to the kind of rhetoric Pete Hegseth has been spreading. What we're seeing isn't just disagreement. It's fear being weaponized inside the military ranks.
Now, I want to remind everyone that these policies that are being referred to date back decades, to the 1940s and 50s, with respect to racial discrimination particularly.
For Reed, that kind of weaponization struck at the heart of what the U.S. military has always stood for. He reminded everyone that decades ago, long before Congress or the White House caught up, the military itself led the way on racial integration.
Senator, you mentioned the 40s and 50s, and you're precisely right. The military was a forerunner in courageous racial integration.
In the 1940s and 50s, while much of the country resisted change, the armed forces showed courage, uniting men and women from every background under one mission. That history matters. It showed that inclusion was never about division. It was about making the force stronger, sharper, more resilient.
The military was a forerunner in courageous racial integration in ways no other institutions were willing to do. I served with men and women of all backgrounds because of the courage of people decades and decades ago. Incredibly important.
But Reed also admitted something else. Today's version of diversity and inclusion has become a lightning rod. Critics slam it as a distraction, a political litmus test that forces commanders to walk on eggshells instead of focusing on combat readiness. Hegseth, never one to hold back, calls it woke poison. But Reed flipped that argument on its head. The real danger, he said, wasn't DEI itself. It was using DEI as a loyalty test, a way to punish anyone who disagrees with one side's political agenda. The question Reed threw on the table was sharp and simple. Are troops being judged on their ability to fight and win, or on how well they conform to a political ideology?
However, the DEI policies of today are not the same as what happened back then. They're dividing troops inside formations, causing commanders to walk on eggshells, not putting meritocracy first.
And that led to the accusation that really put Hegseth on the defensive. Reed said flat out that what Hegseth was advocating was nothing short of an ideological purge, not a merit-based system, not the military America has relied on for generations.
That's the indictment that's made by those serving right now.
Excuse me.
And why we're having this conversation.
Think about what that means inside the chain of command. A military built on silence, fear, and second-guessing. Reed didn't mince words. He called it the worst blow to professionalism in the history of the armed forces.
All of your public comments don't talk about meritocracy. They talk about liberal democratic efforts that are destroying the military, that those people are our enemies. That's not meritocracy. That's a political view. And your goal, as I see emerging, is to politicize the military in favor of your particular positions, which you've outlined extensively, which would be the worst blow to the professionalism of the United States military.
That's why Reed's words cut so deep. He wasn't only exposing a political argument, he was exposing a creeping danger inside the institution that is supposed to rise above politics. And the reason it shocked the room so much is because Reed said what many have whispered but few have dared to say out loud. If the military loses its foundation of meritocracy, it loses everything.
You've been instrumental in securing pardons for several convicted war criminals. In at least two of these cases, the military personnel who served in combat with these convicted service members were not supportive of the pardons. They did their duty as soldiers to report.
When Reed really wanted to land the knockout punch, he pulled out the receipts on Pete Hegseth's most controversial legacy, the pardons. Yes, those Trump-era pardons for convicted war criminals. Reed didn't tiptoe around it. He threw it right into the center of the debate and let the weight of it crash down. Then came the line, the one that felt like Reed dropped a nuclear strike on Hegseth's credibility. He said,
Your definition of lethality seems to embrace those people who do commit war crimes, rather than those who stand up and say, this is not right.
Silence followed, because how do you answer that? Reed wasn't talking about ideology anymore. He was talking about morality, about the very definition of what it means to be a soldier.
Ensuring that the men and women on the front lines have the opportunity to destroy with and close the enemy, and that lawyers aren't the ones getting in the way.
But the clash didn't stop with the pardons. It moved into the bigger, thornier debate, legality versus lethality. Hegseth has long argued that America's rules of engagement are too restrictive, that lawyers sitting in air-conditioned offices in D.C. are tying the hands of warfighters on the ground. In his view, these rules cost lives.
Certainly, I'm not aware of that. It's not one of my efforts, but there's been no accountability for the disaster of the withdrawal in Afghanistan, and that's precisely why we're here today.
And look, there's truth in the frustration. Anyone who's fought in Iraq or Afghanistan has stories about how difficult it was to navigate complicated rules, worrying about paperwork when you're under fire.
But the other factor, too, is you've already disparaged in writing the Geneva Convention, the rules of law, all of these things. How will you be able to effectively lead a military in which one of the principal elements is discipline, respect for lawful authority? You have made statements to your platoon after being briefed by a JAG officer.
But Reed cut through that argument with something few wanted to hear. The rules, the Geneva Conventions, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, they aren't bureaucratic red tape. They're the difference between warriors and criminals. They're what allows America to say to the world, we fight hard, but we fight with honor.
Ensuring let the men and women on the front lines have the opportunity to destroy with and close the enemy, and that lawyers aren't the ones getting in the way.
The question Reed raised was brutal in its simplicity. Do you want an army that fights with total brutality and loses its moral authority? Or an army that fights with discipline, even when it's harder, and keeps America's legitimacy intact?
Senator, you mentioned the word accountability, which is something we have not had for the last 4 years.
Reed warned that Hegseth's warrior-first vision, where legality is brushed aside in the name of lethality, risks turning the U.S. military into something unrecognizable, a rogue force unmoored from law, operating on instinct and vengeance instead of discipline and accountability. That, Reed argued, would be the end of the American model of military power.
Those cases were adjudicated by who? People in Washington or fellow non-commissioned officers who had also served, sacrificed, and believed in the ethic of the military.
And then came the part that probably stung the most. Reed didn't just talk about criminals or rules on paper. He talked about the people who paid the price, the whistleblowers, the soldiers who saw something wrong, stood up, and said, "This isn't who we are." And instead of being honored, many of them were sidelined, branded as troublemakers, quietly pushed out of the ranks. Their reward for courage was exile.
In many of the cases you're talking about in particular, sir, there was evidence withheld, there was prosecutorial misconduct, and as someone who looks case by case and defaults to the warfighter, to the men and women with dust on their boots, not the second guessers in air-conditioned offices in Washington, D.C.
The very people upholding the values the military is supposed to embody were treated as the enemy. Reed called it out directly: a culture of rot, where silence gets rewarded and integrity gets punished. And he wasn't exaggerating. There are documented cases where evidence was withheld, where prosecutorial misconduct let some cases collapse, and where the truth simply disappeared in the fog of politics.
Some were, but others were convicted, and you asked for pardon. That's the only reason you asked for pardon, because they were convicted.
Let's zoom out for a second, because Reed wasn't just dunking on Hegseth for sport. He was pointing at something much bigger, almost existential. The U.S. military, the same force that once prided itself on being America's apolitical shield, now feels like it's being dragged into the mud of partisan trench warfare.
Well, by the way, would you explain what a jag-off is?
And then came Reed's nuke of a sentence, the line that made everyone stop scrolling. Loyalty to a political agenda is quietly replacing loyalty to the Constitution. That's not a hot take. That's a five-alarm fire. Hegseth's talk about cleaning house suddenly doesn't sound like reform. It sounds like a purge. And if that's true, then the military isn't just on thin ice. It's on a knife's edge, wobbling over the abyss. So here's the choice Reed forces us to face. Do we protect merit, unity, and discipline, or let political games fracture the very shield that defends America? And if you don't want to miss more fiery breakdowns like this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now.